Hello and welcome. I'm Yamini here with Paul Vorbach from Academy Global. Today, we're looking at procurement and contract management. Most organizations treat them as two separate things, and there's a surprising cost to doing that. We'll talk about why they're really one life cycle, where value quietly leaks away, and how the best organizations close the gap. Procurement and contract management are usually run by separate teams. And why should we think of them as a single life cycle? And what does the evidence show when they're disconnected?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I probably should create a bit of a caveat here that there are many contracts across public and private sector which are managed end to end through what we might describe as the planning, sourcing, and the management of the arrangement or the contract. But there are also many instances, particularly in large, complex, distributed departments and agencies, where exactly the situation that you've described occurs. And it's in those instances that we see some particular challenges arising. So let's just maybe start with why is it that we separate the management of the contract from everything that went before it in terms of the planning and sourcing? Well, the first thing is to say it's not ideal. So in a perfect world, those of us that are managing contracts have to manage contracts that we were involved in establishing. And so there's a bit of a symmetry there. So if I am unhappy with the contract that I'm managing, I only have myself to blame. And when it comes to organizational relationships and politics, sometimes removing those distinctions can be quite helpful, because for large high value contracts, there's a lot of people interested, a lot of people who are watching. You've got pressure on value for money. You've got pressure from a governance point of view, from a probity point of view. So I guess the starting point to explore this topic is to say it's best, where feasible, to manage the contract that you've been involved with from end to end. But in those instances where that's not possible, there's a few things that we can do to protect value, protect communication, and to ultimately protect the effectiveness of the overall procurement life cycle. So what are the instances specifically where we're likely to see a separation between the planning, sourcing, and then ultimately the management of contracts? We usually see it where you may have a very specialized procurement or category management function based in a head office somewhere. But the practical reality is that the contracts which have been established need to be managed by the business or the organization where that's physically located. So we could be sitting in downtown Parramatta or St George's Terrace in Perth, establishing contracts that have got to be managed in Karratha, or they've got to be managed somewhere in Parramatta or Broken Hill. So in those instances, it's not practical to have people physically remove themselves to go into those other locations, often quite remote locations, and manage those contracts. So there's a practicality in terms of the scope question which arises in relation to that. So where does the noise arise? Well, the noise arises when those who are ultimately responsible for managing the contracts lack a level of awareness and understanding of the background to the contract. Why did the organisation go into the marketplace through a tender process or a quote process to seek offers? What's the nature of the problem we're trying to solve? So understanding the why, what it is that we're trying to achieve through this contract is a very good place to start. Now, very often, the planning for a procurement activity, the sourcing activity, and the appointment of the contractor is undertaken in an environment which is uncertain, where things can arise either through the life of the sourcing activity or even through the life of the contract, which means the contract that's been established is not now really fit for purpose for the problem we're trying to solve. And because the contract manager is very often closer to the business They're closer to the customer or community whose problem they're trying to meet, trying to address. They're closer to the contractor relationship. So when there's frustrations arising between the contractor, between the community or the workforce who wants to see value from the contract, it's often the contract manager who feels like he or she's caught within the crosshairs. And quite quickly, the relationship can become under pressure. And those pressure points in the relationship can extend to relationship difficulties between the internal sourcing or procurement staff and also the contract management staff within the same organisation.
And if the damage starts before the contract's even signed, where exactly does the value leak? And how do the choices at the sourcing stage shape the risks that turn up later?
Yeah, so this is where contract managers need to be a little bit more realistic. I almost want to say sympathetic to the job of sourcing and procurement professionals. So because public sector procurement in particular is so highly prescribed because of the probity obligations that we're all very conscious of in public sector procurement, this brings a particular discipline, and that translates in terms of into structure, in terms of how we migrate from planning, seeking offers, looking for competition, ensuring there's transparency of process, ensuring there's equitable participation in the process. So the steps that I've just described, they all take time. And you can't, you shouldn't rush a procurement activity. But sometimes what happens is that we learn a lot more about what we really want and perhaps even how we might describe what we want and what a best solution might look like. We're learning about that as we go along. And the reason we're learning about that is because the market's constantly changing. Our understanding of the problem we're trying to solve is becoming more acute. And therefore, we get to the position whereby we evaluate offers at a point in time, sometimes months, commonly months, potentially even a year beyond when we started the process. Now, that places an enormous amount of pressure on us getting those requirements documents, sometimes called the specification, absolutely right. Because once we've evaluated offers against those specifications, we need to largely import the requirements, performance indicators into the contract. And then once they're in the contract, they are largely fixed. Now, they, of course, can be changed through a process called contract variation. But each and every time we change an existing contract, we have to typically, especially for high value contracts, make an additional disclosure to the market. We need to get high levels of approval, and we start to challenge the value for money principles through that part of the process. So it's challenging to get a perfect contract at the best of times. And when there's different parties involved in the planning, the initiation, the sourcing phase, and then the handover into contract management, then more time's passed, more learning has occurred, and the challenges just mount.
And coming to my next question, how do organizations feed what they learn during delivery back into the next procurement? And what capability do their people need to do that?
Yes. So the richest learnings always through a contract, and they're by definition also into the prior stages of the planning and the sourcing, arise when contracts don't go according to plan. So you would think on one hand, if we were dispassionate and logical, we would say the richest learning opportunities for our contract management and our procurement arise from contracts that don't go well. So we should seek to uncover and explore and constructively get into the detail of why those contracts didn't work. But unfortunately, the opposite's the case. So when contracts perform poorly, often there's a tension there can be conflict within the organization between the sourcing and the procurement staff for the reasons we talked about earlier on. And there can be additional conflict between the contract manager and the contractor, the vendor, the supplier. So therefore, the conditions that you need to have, good, honest, proper review processes to genuinely capture the richness of lessons learned are often thwarted and frustrated because there's been a detrimental impact on the relationship between at least those three critical parties. So what it takes is courage. It requires honesty. It requires some organizational discipline for post-contract reviews to be undertaken with a degree of real diligence and honesty and thoroughness. And it really is the job of the contract owner, and maybe ultimately, if it's different, the contract sponsor, the person who's ultimately approved the contract from the very beginning, to take a very deliberate and direct interest in ensuring that these processes of review take place, that they're resourced, and they take place properly.
For teams wanting to build that integrated capability, where should they start?
So the reality is that across public and private sector, but our evidence is much clearer here in public sector environments because of processes like internal audits, but also in particular the external audits from the audit authorities. We get some good data on the fact that not only do contracts too frequently not deliver value, but we also get insights in terms of where they fail. So to answer the question in terms of what do positive interventions look like, it's really got to be based upon what do we learn through the post-contract review. So the post-contract review really provides us with the gold to be able to understand which part didn't get done well. Now, in the Academy Global Contract Management programs, we work through a series of 12 principles, and those 12 principles are very solid indicators in terms of predictors as to whether value for money, probity, successful operational outcomes are going to be achieved or not. So we take a 12 principles approach, and that starts from the communication that exists between the procurement or the sourcing manager and the contract manager at the very beginning, at the time that the contract's been established. And then we trace the remaining 11 principles throughout the journey of the contract, right through to including the post-contract review. So the good news is that contract management is one of those areas that can be learned, it can be taught, and when it's an experience-based program, the insights can be very, very rich, and the practical opportunities to do things better it's very prominent as well.
Right. That connection between the two halves of the life cycle, it's an important one. So thank you so much, Paul, and thank you all for joining us.